This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Nelson Mandela's political ascendancy was shaped by the advent of photojournalism, by pictures. Journalism directed at black South Africans in the 1950s to a much greater degree than black South African politicians, or indeed any politicians of earlier generations in South Africa. His popularity was facilitated, it was empowered by images. And for this reason, I've responded to the questions that I was asked to address at today's meeting. I was asked to explore his emergence as a leader. And I'm going to do this by looking at some pictures, each of which I think offer helpful insights about how he functioned as a leader. And as we'll see, the pictures themselves were of enduring importance in perpetuating and enhancing Mandela's moral stature. Now, in the 1950s and the 1960s, Mandela's leadership was shared by the availability of a new political audience in South Africa for news communicated through photographs. And for more than a decade, and indeed for decades after the 1950s, pictures of Mandela would project stories about a particular kind of leader and a particular sort of leadership. I'm going to argue that Mandela's leadership combined three qualities. And the three qualities were as follows. First of all, there was the attribute of messianic heroism. And then secondly, there was the way that he embodied patrimonial authority. And thirdly, there was the conception of Mandela as the leader with a vision, as the strategist, the person who would show the way. And for those of you who are technically interested in the analysis of leadership, you'll immediately recognize that these are the three dimensions of leadership that correspond with the conventional analytical distinctions between charismatic, traditional, and legal rational types of authority. Here's my first picture. It's a well-known picture. In March 1961, after the withdrawal of charges at the end of the treason trial, Nelson Mandela leaves the courtroom in Pretoria, accompanied, on his right, by Moses Kotane, Secretary General of the Communist Party. Now, by this time, early 1961, Mandela had displaced Albert Luthuli, not formally, but in the public eye, as the ANC's most influential personality. The essence of the picture, though she's not in fact referring to this particular image, is quite nicely captured in a quotation from Ellen Kuzwayo's autobiography. She was a school teacher in Pimville in those days. And she writes, "I remember the glamorous Nelson Mandela of those days. The beautiful scarf he wore stands out in my mind to this day. And many people, when they remember Mandela in the 50s, they describe him with reference to the clothes that he wore. And in many ways, for Mandela, somebody this morning was talking about masks, but clothes, costume, appearances, and dissembling through clothes and costume were an important ingredient of his personality." Now, I want to talk about this picture, though, in a little bit more detail, and some of the things that can be associated with the picture. To use the phrase from Sipho Sapamla's poem, which is inspired by this picture, here is Mandela leaving the courtroom victorious. It's not, of course, the courtroom where he was sent to prison. It's an earlier courtroom, the courtroom of the treason trial. And he's leaving the courtroom victorious, to use Sipamla's phrase, higher than hope. And here we have Mandela. Sartorial elegance, physical potency, assertive action. These are the attributes here as he shoulders his way through the spectators. Now, by this stage, Mandela and his comrades had developed a deliberate policy of using the press to extend and build Mandela's public standing. No ANC leader before had even thought or cared about what newspapers wrote about them or how they represented them, largely because newspapers paid the ANC very little attention before the 1950s. But Mandela, at the time that this picture had been taken, had been presenting himself to the media for a decade. As one of his Nkonto comrades, Raymond Mlaba, put it, in left-wing papers, our papers, new prominency was given to Mandela, even during the time of Luthuli. And it's certainly true, the Communist Party's controlled press, New Age, and the various other publications the party put out, more or less, when they talked about the ANC, when they talked about the ANC leadership, they embodied it in Mandela. A few days after this photograph was taken, Mandela, in Slovo's words, became a fugitive and began to live the life, rather self-consciously, of a professional revolutionary. In fact, he went into hiding and began a course of reading on how to become a revolutionary. In 1961, their organizations driven into clandestinity, ANC and Communist Party organizers were beginning to invest heavily in creating a narrative about messianic, self-sacrificial leaders, leaders whose lives represented a story. This particular picture of Mandela would reappear again and again during the next 3 decades of Mandela's incarceration, maintaining his status as an ageless savior awaiting his second coming, waiting to emerge victorious. As you can see from the photograph, Mandela was careful, indeed fussy, about his appearance. Tariq Ali this morning in the film talked about Mandela as a god. I'm not sure about as a god, but certainly Mandela had a certain vanity. I think that vanity was an important ingredient of his personality and had something to do, by the way, with that narrative about reconciliation and forgiveness. But anyway, he fussed about his appearance, about what he wore and how he appeared in public. Photographers would frequently be approached afterwards by Mandela at the stage when they were considering which pictures to publish, and he would give them advice or ask for certain pictures to be withdrawn. Here, in this picture, he's dressed in his role as a member of South Africa's tiny African professional elite. And his professional achievements as a lawyer were not merely instrumental for him in his political ascendancy, though indeed they had a lot to do with it. But I think we need to take Mandela's law seriously. He was a lawyer by training and by vocation. Mandela lived by rules, codes, and an etiquette of behavior ingrained in him by an ethos of honor, learnt both at his African childhood home, at the Anglophile schools that he attended, and in the court civilities that he learned. In this picture, following in his wake is Moses Kotane, the leader of the Communist Party. The evidence of Mandela's party membership by this stage is, and I'll defer to Stephen here, fairly conclusive. Not quite, I'd argue, but fairly. And his role was decisive in prompting both the party and the ANC to embrace a strategy of limited violence. Limited, the qualification is important. In the courtroom only a few months before, during cross-examination, during the treason trial in late 1960, before he attended that meeting that he sat in on, where the party decided that it needed to consider how to prepare itself for forceful action. He had described in cross-examination a hypothetical scenario in which, in return for government incorporation of Africans into Parliament via a qualified franchise, he would consider reciprocally as a reasonable exchange a suspension of militant campaigning. And the strategic assumptions here were not really at odds with the party's recent resolution to consider forcible forms of struggle when these became necessary and desirable. To quote from the text of the resolution it adopted at that meeting that you've just heard about in December 1960. Kotane, by the way, Moses Kotane, was opposed to the party's conversion into a vehicle for insurgent warfare. He had sharp misgivings about Umkhonto we Sizwe. As a tactician, during the 1950s, Mandela had in fact been one of the more cautious figures within the ANC leadership, supporting the early curtailment of protests, opposing the use of picketing during strikes. Mandela's membership of the party, if that's what it was, did not represent a significant switch, I think, in his loyalties. In a reflective commentary he wrote in 1961 during the closing stages of the treason trial, he forecast the possibility that working cooperation between a non-Marxist political organization and the Communist Party might cease because policy differences might emerge. After his African tour at the beginning of 1962, Mandela became convinced that the party's role in directing Umkhonto we Sizwe should be downgraded so that the ANC could maintain Pan-African alliances. And it's likely that by that stage he was reviewing his own membership of the party, in as much as he'd actually saw himself as joining it. It's one caveat that I think one should always keep in mind when one thinks about personalities like Mandela and the organizations that they joined. And that is the extent to which those organizations defined their loyalties, their first loyalties, their primary values. Here's a second picture. Oh, by the way, because one should always acknowledge who takes the pictures, the first picture was taken by Alf Kumalo. The second one was taken by Eli Weinberg. And here Mandela is dressed as a Tembu prince in 1961 while in hiding. The shawl that he's wearing is actually a bedspread, I was informed this morning by Paul Truelha. And Albertina Sisulu this time provides the quotation, writing about Mandela, or rather thinking about Mandela aloud, to her daughter-in-law, who was writing Sisulu's biography. The people liked to look up to a leader who was regal and distant. This picture was taken when Mandela was in hiding in a flat in Hillbrow, or rather in Yeovil, a flat that belonged, or that was being rented by Wolfie Kodesh, the sort of party chauffeur who provided the crucial intermediary through which the various people in hiding kept in touch with each other. Now, the photographer, Eli Weinberg, was a member of the Communist Party, and the photograph was deliberately posed to project Mandela's African identity and his aristocratic lineage at a time when the ANC and its allies were losing support to their Pan-Africanist rivals. But party strategists had other reasons to accentuate the ANC's appeal to South Africa's peasant population, for they were hoping to build guerrilla bases in the countryside. And linked to this was something else, a doctrinal belief. It wasn't true, by the way, that the South African Communist Party's grasp of Marxist theory stopped in 1917, or even stopped at the death of Stalin. The party had latched on to a new idea current in Soviet Marxism from about 1955, that post-colonial African countries could follow a non-capitalist path to socialism that could draw upon still existing communalist peasant social structure. In his 1962 plea in mitigation, when he was being tried for sedition, Mandela described early African societies in which there were no classes, no rich, no poor, no exploitation. Mandela's early ascent as a leader was certainly facilitated by his supposed aristocratic antecedents that he actually rather exaggerated. And by 1952, he was being celebrated for these in praise poetry written and sang and performed in the Eastern Cape. At his first trial, Mandela would make his first appearance dressed more or less in this fashion, rather more elaborately. Winnie supplied the props. And he would open his defense by asking for recusal on the grounds that he would not recognize the court's authority. He did it by the way of exquisite courtesy, always a person for the civilities. He told the judge, or the magistrate rather, that in no kind of way was he in any sort of way impugning the magistrate's integrity. The man was a colleague whom he knew from earlier sparrings in court. It wasn't the first political use of his lineage that Mandela had made. Unusually amongst ANC leaders, he'd maintained contact with rural leaders. Indeed, he bought a farm in 1956. A man needs land, he once said. He needs to own his own piece of land. He maintained contact with rural leaders, especially in the Transkei, for he was anxious that the ANC should retain support from the chieftaincy despite the latter's incorporation into tribal authorities. And throughout his imprisonment, Mandela would maintain a courteous correspondence with homeland leaders, including Chief Buthelezi and, of course, his kinsman, Kaiser Batanzima. And significantly, it was Winnie, Madikizela Mandela, who chose and supplied Mandela with his court costume, and like him, she too could and did, when she chose to, draw upon her own family's patrimonial status when she needed to. So Mandela could put on clothes as a rural chief, just as he could assume the dress of a communist revolutionary. You saw him in the film this morning in Algeria wearing guerrilla combat fatigues. He was rather fond of those. He continued to wear them when he returned to South Africa. They doubled up as a kind of boiler suit in which he could pretend to be a driver. But that's the point. Mandela loved dressing up. And maybe joining the party was dressing up. Mandela's own understanding of tribal government was that it was essentially democratic. All members of the tribe could participate in decisions at the council, variously, as he put it, called Imbizo or Bitso or Khotla. And after all had spoken, then the leader would speak. It was a style of consensus building that Mandela professedly admired, and at times, but only when it suited him, reproduced. Significantly, at the key meeting at which communists decided to prepare to use force. By the way, force was the word they used, not violence. Mandela is recorded by Bob Heppel as remaining silent, listening, not speaking. A good leader, he said once, is like a shepherd, always behind his flock. Third picture. I don't know who the photograph was, the photographer. It's the picture, of course, taken during his first years of imprisonment. He's wearing shorts, as you can see. Well, you can only just see because he's so crouched up and hunched He's not shouldering his way through any crowds here. He's not on display. This is not a picture in which he is controlling his appearances. It's a picture in which he's trying to be as unconscious of the camera as he can be, in his own world, not the world of the cameraman. An early concession that the Robben Islander prisoners won was that they were allowed, about a year after this picture was taken, to wear trousers, not shorts, to dress like men, not boys. This was one of the very few photographs that the authorities released. They released no photographs of Mandela after 1965. And as you heard this morning, the photographs of Mandela that remained in circulation could not be legally published inside South Africa. A major theme in much of the biographical treatment of Mandela is the way that his imprisonment reinforced his political authority. I think this happened in three ways. First of all, Mandela was successful in establishing himself at the head of the Robben Island prison community, and this wasn't a given. It took a fairly determined imposition of his own will and his own understanding of the world. It enabled both him and his comrades from the 50s to exercise influence over successive generations of younger political leaders who underwent shorter spells of confinement. He also, in prison, re-established the ANC's political ascendancy over the Communist Party, and a critical debate with Govan Mbeki over the party's relationship with the ANC was decisive. For Mbeki favoured a transformationist perspective in which the two organisations would merge. Secondly, imprisonment and the consequent invisibility that imprisonment brought to Mandela meant that his personality and his achievement would be understood through the words and images in circulation at the time of his capture. To the ANC's followers, he remained a vigorous, commanding presence. A young man. An effect that was also enhanced by Winnie Mandela's emergence as a leader in her own right. And his potency remained undamaged, unblemished, because he was removed from the arenas in which leaders could falter and fail. And thirdly, it was the isolation of prison and the distance that this isolation put between him and the movement that had hitherto nurtured him politically, that enabled him to develop the will to assert his own authority independently of the movement, to use that phrase of Tariq Ali's, to behave like a god. A key consideration in helping to create the circumstances that allowed a pacted and bargained transition from apartheid, which, whatever its shortcomings, was the only transition that was on offer. And this was especially the case after his transfer to Pollsmoor in 1982. And Mandela's internal life, the world to which he escaped when he was in prison, his development of an interior, imaginative world, inhabited by family, by friendships, by stories and by dreams, as expressed and constructed in his remarkable letter writing, and the full correspondence of Mandela still awaits and deserves publication. But this internal life, about which we know more about Mandela than any other South African leader, helped to reinforce his growing political autonomy from the movement that he professed loyalty to.
Tom,
I'll wind up. So Mandela supplied three vital attributes of leadership. Heroism. He and his comrades understood that in the absence of a strong organisation, charismatic leadership was essential to mobilise black South Africans. Patriarchal authority, rank, lineage, order and precedence were still key considerations in a setting in which many people were caught up in pre-industrial and communal social ties. and strategic purpose. Mandela and his contemporaries were committed to winning power. They were the first generation of black South Africans to actually believe that they could. And Mandela's capacity to exercise different kinds of status, ascriptive and achieved, was a critical factor in building the kinds of alliances and fronts that would mobilize support within and outside South Africa.
Thank you very much indeed.